Hi everyone, I'm Paul Orfanos, the National Community Engagement Manager at Delphi Bank, which is a division of the Bendigo Adelaide Group, and welcome to Delphi Connect, a segment where, as part of our commitment to community engagement, we bring you leading experts from fields as far and wide as economics and the market, property, health, scientific research, community affairs, just to name a few. Hopefully you'll find our segments both informative and enjoyable. Let's move straight on to today's guest, Angie Zigomanis, who is a Director of Charter Keck Kramer, one of Australia's leading independent strategic property consulting firms. Angie, thanks for joining us today.
No problem. Happy to be here, Paul.
During the height of COVID restrictions last year, Angie, there were some predictions that residential property values would decrease from pre-COVID values. One estimate that I'd heard was that prices were going to drop by up to 30%. It hasn't panned out this way. In fact, we're seeing house prices increase in most capital cities. What are your thoughts on house prices in the midterm?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, at the initial stages of COVID, when unemployment shot up and the economy locked down, prices did actually fall. But there were a lot of stimulus measures put in place to help arrest some of those declines. The federal government introduced the JobKeeper and JobSaver, and that helped people with employment and incomes. Meanwhile, the Reserve Bank also cut interest rates and introduced the TPP, which also reduced fixed rates as well for short-term rates for 1, 3 and 5 year periods. So they all made housing a lot more affordable for the next round of buyers. And so as the economy reopened and economic conditions strengthened, a lot of people started coming back into the market. Part of the encouragement also came from state governments who introduced various first home buyer incentives, from stamp duty concessions to cash bonuses, etc. And in the new housing market, the federal government also introduced the home builder package as well. So all these stimulus measures and incentives brought a lot of new buyers into the market. And for about a 3 to 6 month period, there were a lot of home buyers also sitting out of the market waiting to see what would happen with COVID. And so this led to some pent-up demand adding to the current demand and the boosted demand from the stimulus to really drive much stronger demand in the housing market and drive up prices. And so across all the capital cities from around the third quarter last year, we've seen double-digit rises in house prices.
The rising tide hasn't yet lifted all boats. It seems like the detached housing market has led the way, whilst the apartment market, particularly within the central city regions, has borne the COVID-19 impacts. Is it the same for most major cities?
Yeah, well, that's right. The detached housing market and we should say the regional housing markets as well have tended to be much stronger than the smaller dwelling markets such as the apartment markets and the central city markets. And that's largely due to the impacts of COVID. The federal government has effectively shut borders, and that's reduced net overseas migration, and Australia has experienced a net overseas migration outflow over the past 12 months. And so a lot of migration into the country, the first thing they do where they look for a place to stay is look for a rental dwelling, and often in a high amenity area such as close to the inner city and those areas. So that has really affected the rental market for apartments, particularly in central city areas where those first migrants come and look for the jobs rich locations. So that's affected rents, and some of the inner city areas, for example in CBD Melbourne, asking rents have probably dropped by about 25 to 30%. So there's been a massive decrease in rental demand, and that's having a flow-on effect for prices. But on the flip side is that obviously the detached housing market has done much better. Part of that has been led by the various federal governments and state government incentives, but also I think the fact that a lot of more people are now working from home because of the COVID pandemic have really said, well, look, those who were living in apartments have said, look, this is probably not suitable for our needs at the moment. We need an extra space for working. We need more space for outdoor recreation within a dwelling, just because, such as lockdowns we're seeing, people need a lot more air and connection with nature, I guess. And so a lot of those people who have been living in apartments and smaller dwellings have also gravitated towards larger dwellings, and often that's been either to the outer suburbs, and so within the big capital cities, the outer suburban vacancy rates are much lower than they are in the middle suburbs, But we've also seen strong demand in regional areas as well. So for those where they're not tethered as much to work as they used to be, and now they are happy to move into regional locations. In Victoria it might be Ballarat, Bendigo, those sorts of places. In New South Wales would be Newcastle, Wollongong, and in Queensland we've seen very strong demand on the Gold Sunshine Coast nowadays.
Now, traditionally, population growth due to immigration has been a large contributing factor that has led to an increase in demand for property. What would be the impact, in your opinion, on the property market of a lower net overseas migration flows due to the border closures?
Yeah. Well, in the short term, we're seeing it now. As mentioned, we're seeing much lower rental demand, and particularly in those inner city markets. But over the medium to longer term, research that Charter Kramer has undertaken shows that an overseas migrant initially comes in as a renter, but the rate of shifting into ownership increases markedly from probably about 4 years after they arrive to 7 years after they arrive. So many of those migrants who do come and stay on and become permanent residents between years 4 and 7 tend to largely increasingly become owner occupiers. And so I think the ramifications of that low overseas migration we're seeing right now will start to translate to decreased demand for new dwellings 3 to 4 or 5 years out from now.
That's very interesting. Do we expect to see any structural changes to the market once the COVID pandemic hopefully is over? And do you believe that these changes will be permanent?
Yeah, well, at the moment, I guess we are seeing some of those changes evolve. We're seeing a move more towards detached houses. We're seeing a move more towards regional areas. And interestingly, it's not just COVID that's probably causing this. Some of it is also demographics. So over the last 10 years or so, the millennial generation, who's probably the biggest population cohort in terms of size in Australia, they are largely now in their late 20s and 30s. But over the next 10 years, they start moving into their 30s and 40s, and they start moving on to the next life stage where they're coupling up, having children, etc. So many of those people were living in apartments close to the city, or living in smaller dwellings, or sharing as couples without children. But now they'll increasingly move on to that next stage of family life, having children, etc. And speaking from personal experience, I'm sure you're probably in the same case, Paul. Once you're having family and children and everything else, it's you're moving to the house in the burbs, or in the regional centres, or perhaps other things as well. So part of that structural change, I think, is already happening in terms of just the changing demographics of population. COVID, to some extent, has probably accelerated it, and it way well not just accelerated, but exaggerated as well, in the sense that a lot of these family-forming households might have moved to just to the outer suburbs, or might have moved to a house in the existing area, but now the option is there because of working from home that they can move to a regional area, and they can really capitalise on buying a bigger family dwelling, a larger block, a different lifestyle. And I think we'll see some of obviously that's happening now, but I think to some extent that'll be locked in over the longer term as well, particularly if employers continue to be flexible in terms of where people can work.
Now, a common topic of discussion, especially, Angie, when it comes to property, is that Sydney and Melbourne rank amongst the most expensive cities in the world. Australia-wide, we've seen home ownership levels fall from 70 to 65% approximately in the last 20 years. And equally, home equity levels have fallen from about 80% to 80% to 75%. Younger people are increasingly finding it difficult to enter the housing markets in our major cities. How far into the future do you believe that we'll see this trend continuing?
Well, it's interesting. I think if you actually look at just the last 12 months, one of the impacts of COVID has been to actually increase the rate of home ownership. A lot of people have taken advantage of the government stimulus because as prices rise in response to lower interest rates, mortgage repayments might still stay the same relative to income because those higher prices are being offset by lower rates. But the problem is, as prices increase, the deposit hurdle for a buyer gets bigger and bigger. And so, we're at 10% of a $500,000 house is obviously $50,000, but $1 million house is $100,000. So it becomes a lot harder for that person, even though mortgage rates might halve, and the mortgage rates might mean repayments aren't going to change too much. So that deposit hurdle I think the government incentives that were introduced, such as stamp duty concessions, cash bonuses, etc., that helped a lot of first home buyers actually get into the market. And so for this brief period, we're probably seeing first home buyer demand increase. But the problem is now we're also seeing rising house prices, and that will make it harder, continue to make it harder for those first home buyers to get into the market because of that high deposit hurdle. And that'll continue to play out over the next few years because at this stage we don't necessarily see a major correction in prices.
I suppose linked to that former question is that one dream that traditionally most of us in Australia have is to own our own home. In your view, is this expectation still as embraced as it once was? Or are we going, Angie, down that European model where people become long-term renters?
Look, I think there's probably an element of the population that that prefers the flexibility of not being locked into a long-term mortgage and a long-term home. And there are probably people who are happy to make that trade-off of ownership to be able to live in a location where they want to. So, you know, they may not be able to afford to buy a place in a city or close to the city, but renting is more manageable for them. And so I think that there will be an element of the population that do become long-term renters, either for affordability reasons as prices go up and they just can't get into the market, but then others for lifestyle regions where they just can't afford the market that they want to get into and they want to live in. So I think there's an element of that, and we're seeing the market perhaps begin to start evolve and adapt to that, where some of the big institutional players are now moving into that build-to-rent sector, where a tenant can come in and has a lot more certainty of tenure, and doesn't necessarily leave themselves to the whims of a landlord who might sell the property under them or whatever else, because you know they will be guaranteed long-term tenure within that place. And so, so I think we're I think the market will sort of evolve into a higher proportion of perhaps population renting, and also, as I said, we're seeing some of the developers sort of adapt to that growing segment.
And finally, a good feature in the Australian economy at the moment is that there's a positive trend in jobs growth. What is Charter Keck Kramer's view relating to this trend in jobs growth over the next 3 years?
Yeah, well, the jobs growth has been very, very interesting. In a post-COVID environment, in a period of weaker economic growth, you'd normally expect weaker employment growth as well. But offsetting that has been that lower level of net overseas migration. And so, over 1% of Australia's population growth per annum has been from net overseas migration. And so, if you're having employment growth of 1%, if you're having economic and employment growth of 1% per annum, but you're not getting those overseas migrants, then all of a sudden you're starting to, the local population is starting to soak up all those jobs. And so, so we've seen a lot of pressure in a lot of sectors that have typically relied on overseas migrants to supply a workforce, have really tightened up. And in regional areas particularly, you can see in the fruit picking sectors where there's been a lot of working holiday maker visa migrants coming in and obviously contributing there, and also in hospitality where and food service, where there's a lot of people, so a lot of migrants who come and work in that industry. There's been a lot of employers and businesses who are struggling to find appropriate people in those sectors as well. And so, despite all the I suppose the challenges the economy faced, the most recent data showed that the unemployment rate fell below 5%, which was the lowest level since the middle of the 2000s. So, as long as the net overseas migration stays lower and Australia still has a pretty solid level of employment growth, we expect to see the unemployment rate tighten further. Having said that, of course, at the moment we're obviously in lockdown in Melbourne and Sydney and various levels, I guess, of tightened conditions in the other states. And so it really also depends on how well Australia manages the virus going forward. Will there be rolling lockdowns? Do we end up getting vaccinated at a much higher level that allows the economy to open up fully, and for migration to come back as well? So there are a lot of questions at the moment, but assuming Australia does manage to continue, I guess, its relatively good management of COVID, then we expect the unemployment rate to still stay pretty low and continue to tighten in the coming years.
Thank you, Ange, for sharing your insights with us today. I really appreciate your time.
No problem at all. Thanks, Paul.
That's all for today on Delphi Connect. On behalf of all of us at Delphi Bank, thanks for joining us. Bye for now.